Hello, friends. If you're curious about the movie Let Him Go, 2020, you're in the perfect place. Don't forget to give this video a quick like, it really helps us out. And if you're new here, hit subscribe to stay updated on all the latest movie deep dives. Let's jump right in. The open plains stretch endlessly beneath a sky that refuses to tell you what's coming. It's quiet in the way that only the American Midwest can be, peaceful on the surface, but holding secrets like a storm on the horizon. That's the landscape Let Him Go is set against, a neo-Western thriller rooted in heartbreak, justice, and the unbreakable grip of love and loss. This 2020 film, directed by Thomas Bezucha, adapts Larry Watson's novel of the same name and brings it to vivid, emotionally charged life with powerhouse performances by Kevin Costner and Diane Lane. But this isn't just a story about a couple chasing after family. It's about what happens when grief is twisted into resolve and love is forced into war. We begin in 1960s Montana, where George and Margaret Blackledge live a quiet life on their ranch. George is a retired sheriff, stoic and observant, a man whose strength lies not in words but in the way he watches the world. Margaret, warm but fierce, is the kind of woman whose heart has always been bigger than the boundaries around her. Together, they raise their grandson after their son's sudden death in a horseback accident, until the boy's mother, Lorna, remarries and everything begins to unravel. The new husband, Donnie Weboy, is more shadow than substance from the start. Controlling, abrupt, and unkind, he exudes a quiet threat that Margaret notices long before George says a word. When Lorna, Donnie, and the child suddenly vanish, no goodbyes, no forwarding address, it's not just a strange choice. It's a warning. Margaret, driven by maternal instinct and the memory of her son, refuses to sit idle. She convinces George to join her on a journey to find them. They saddle up not with horses, but with silence, a packed suitcase, and decades of lawman intuition. What begins as a search for their grandson becomes something far more dangerous. The journey takes them deep into the Dakotas, where they discover the Weboy family isn't just unsettling, they're terrifying. At the helm is Blanche Weboy, played with icy brilliance by Lesley Manville, the matriarch whose home is less safe haven and more fortress. Blanche doesn't threaten outright. She smiles as she sharpens the knife. Her sons, cruel and loyal in equal measure, orbit her like storm clouds waiting to crack. It becomes clear that Lorna and the boy aren't just living with family. They're being held there, caught in a web of fear and submission. Margaret and George, unarmed in the literal sense, arrive with only their resolve. But the tension that follows isn't born from shootouts or chases. It's built in hushed dinners, long stares, and the soft scrape of a chair pulling away from a table. Every scene with the Weboys simmers. You feel the danger long before anyone raises a voice. And that's what makes the story so chilling. Violence is promised, but never in a way that lets you prepare for it. It just happens. The film's pacing mirrors its landscape, slow, deliberate, but never dull. You walk alongside George and Margaret, feeling the weight of every decision. And when the violence finally does erupt, it's like lightning on a clear day. Fast, brutal, and unforgettable. A shotgun blast in the dark. A scream cut short. Fire swallowing the stillness. These moments hit harder not because they're graphic, but because they're earned. The calm before the storm has been so expertly drawn that when it breaks, it feels like a betrayal. But the true emotional engine of Let Him Go isn't the fight, it's the bond between George and Margaret. Their marriage is a portrait of quiet love, the kind that doesn't need declarations. You see it in how they sit beside each other in diners. In how they navigate grief without collapsing. In how George, a man who has seen his fair share of violence, chooses every step carefully. Not for himself, but for her. And Margaret? She's the heart, the one who refuses to let her family slip into the dark. Her determination isn't loud. It's firm, patient, and unstoppable. As they descend further into the Weboys' territory, they find an unexpected ally in Peter Dragswolf, a young Native American man with his own history of displacement and survival. His character, played by Boo Boo Stewart, adds another layer of depth to the story, a reminder that loss and injustice don't come in one form, and that resilience often comes from those who've had everything taken before. Peter isn't just a side character. He's a quiet witness to the pain that runs through the land, and his bond with Margaret and George becomes a rare light in the growing dark. And that darkness, once it arrives, does not hold back. The final act of the film is a masterclass in escalation. It's a confrontation that was never going to end peacefully. George knows it. Margaret knows it. Even Blanche, in her chilling calm, seems to welcome it. And when the final shots are fired, when the house burns and choices are made, it's not about revenge. It's about love meeting fire. About letting go, not because it's easy, but because it's the only way forward. The title, Let Him Go, is deceptively simple. On one level, it refers to their grandson, taken, shielded, and fought for. But on another, deeper level, it's about grief. About the death of a son, a future, a life that can't be rewritten. George and Margaret carry that weight in every scene. Their journey isn't just across state lines. It's through the stages of grief, the rawness of love, and the harsh truth that some goodbyes never come when you want them to. Critics praised the film not just for its performances, but for its restraint. It's a thriller with the soul of a drama, a western that trades gunslingers for grandparents, and yet remains just as tense. The cinematography, sweeping yet intimate, lets the land speak. The script is sharp, elegant in its sparseness. And the direction? It lets silence do the heavy lifting. In a world full of noise, Let Him Go whispers, and you lean in to listen. So what can you expect if you haven't seen it yet? Expect to feel. To be drawn into a world where the quiet is scarier than the chaos. Where villains smile and heroes cry. Where the wind carries more than dust, it carries memory. Expect twists that come not from deception, but from decisions. From people choosing what they're willing to lose to protect what they love. And expect an ending that doesn't tie everything neatly, but leaves you standing in the ashes, asking what you would have done. Let Him Go is a film that earns its weight, scene by scene. It takes you on a journey not just through miles, but through emotion, through resolve, through heartbreak. It's not loud. It's not showy. But it stays with you, long after the credits roll, long after the fire dies out. And in a way, that's the point. Because when love refuses to yield, even to time, even to death, it doesn't scream. It endures. Quietly. Like a whisper on the wind. And that's where this story leaves us. With loss. With love. With legacy. We'll be back with more journeys into powerful stories, unforgettable characters, and the moments that shape them. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to keep exploring the heart behind the cinema. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and never underestimate the strength of the quiet ones. The land stretches wide and silent under a cloud-washed sky. In the wind-swept expanse of Montana, time moves with the rhythm of horses and the creak of old wood. It's here, in this world of understated beauty and quiet grief, that George and Margaret Blackledge live a life marked by routine and an undercurrent of loss. Their days are simple, shaped by chores and family, and anchored in the presence of their grown son James, his gentle wife Lorna, and their newborn grandson Jimmy. They're not loud people, the Blackledges. They don't need to be. There's a steadiness to them, like the land they live on, strong, weathered, patient. But peace is a fragile thing, and it's shattered one day without warning. James, while riding a horse through familiar terrain, suffers a fatal accident. It's quick and merciless. One moment, he's alive. The next, he's gone, swallowed by the silence of the prairie. His death leaves more than an empty space in the family. It leaves a fracture that no one speaks of, but everyone feels. Margaret, especially, clings to the pieces. Her love for Jimmy, her grandson, intensifies. She becomes a quiet sentinel in the boy's life, offering help and warmth to Lorna, who's left adrift as a single mother. George, as always, stands beside her, not saying much, but watching everything. His strength is the kind that carries others through the storm without ever asking for thanks. In the early days after James's death, the family finds a rhythm again. There's sorrow, yes, but also resilience. Margaret helps care for Jimmy. George repairs fences and tends to the land. Lorna, though reserved, begins to smile again. But change has its own way of creeping in. Lorna begins to see Donny Weboy, a man whose presence brings a subtle discomfort that's hard to pin down. He's polite, at first. Quiet. Respectful. But there's a tension under his words, something Margaret picks up on almost immediately. George, ever the observer, keeps his distance, but doesn't miss a thing. When Lorna remarries Donny, Margaret's unease becomes something sharper. Still, she tries to accept it. For Jimmy's sake. For Lorna's. She watches from the outside, her instincts humming just beneath the surface, trying not to interfere, but unable to look away. And then one day everything changes. Without a goodbye, without a word, Lorna, Donny, and little Jimmy vanish. They pack up and leave town, slipping out like shadows in the night. Margaret hears about it second-hand, from someone at the store, a casual mention that the Weboys are gone. It's not just a relocation. It's a retreat. A disappearance. There's no phone number. No address. Just silence. And for Margaret, that silence becomes unbearable. It's not just the loss of her grandson. It's the fear. The gnawing certainty that something is wrong. Margaret doesn't wait for answers to come to her. She gathers what she can, pulling out maps, asking questions, chasing breadcrumbs that lead her and George to the small towns of North Dakota, where the Weboy family is said to live. It's not a journey of revenge. It's not even a rescue mission, yet. It's a grandmother and a grandfather, chasing down a family that's taken something too precious to be left behind. George, ever the pragmatist, warns her. Tells her it might not go the way she hopes. But Margaret has already made up her mind. Their drive through the American plains is quiet, filled with long stretches of road and occasional conversation. They share meals in roadside diners, sleep in modest motels. It feels almost like a second honeymoon, if not for the storm that's waiting at the end of it. And soon, they begin to learn more about the family they're seeking. The Weboys are a name spoken with caution. In one town, a local sheriff hesitates when Margaret asks about them. In another, a store clerk pretends not to know the name at all. Eventually, they track down Bill Weboy, one of Donny's relatives, whose demeanor is all grins and false charm. He invites them to visit the family. To come meet Blanche Weboy, the matriarch. She'll be thrilled, he says, but there's something in his tone that makes Margaret and George exchange a glance. They follow his directions down a long gravel road, through a patch of wilderness that feels increasingly isolated. The Weboy house appears like a monument at the end of the world, wide, quiet, and perched just a little too far from everything else. The home looks normal enough, but something about it feels staged, like a painting of a home rather than the real thing. Inside, they meet Blanche. Lesley Manville's Blanche Weboy is a masterclass in subtle menace. She's welcoming on the surface, all smiles and southern hospitality, but underneath it all is steel. She controls the room without raising her voice. She sits at the head of the table with a calm that makes your skin crawl. The Weboy sons hover around her like dogs waiting for orders. And Lorna, when they finally see her again, looks different. Diminished. Tired. Trapped. Margaret's instincts flare. George remains composed, but his hand lingers near the edge of the table. The dinner that follows is a dance of politeness and veiled threats. Blanche insists everything is fine. That Jimmy is happy. That they're welcome to visit, but not too often. Not too soon. It's clear that the Weboys aren't just a family. They're a system. A regime. And Lorna and Jimmy are the latest to fall under their control. After leaving the house, Margaret is more certain than ever. Jimmy isn't safe. But George, ever careful, urges caution. They're outnumbered, outgunned. This isn't a simple matter of asking for custody. The law won't help. The town won't help. And the Weboys, clearly, won't be giving Jimmy back out of kindness. Margaret wants to act, to do something now, but George knows the cost of rushing. They need a plan. It's during this uncertain pause that they meet Peter Dragswolf, a young man living alone on the outskirts of town. He offers them kindness without asking questions, shelter without condition. There's a quiet understanding in him. He knows what it's like to lose family, to be pushed out, to live in the shadow of stronger forces. His bond with Margaret and George becomes a quiet alliance, a small island of hope in an increasingly hostile landscape. As they regroup, Margaret reflects on the past, not just the loss of her son, but the years that shaped her, the quiet grief she's carried like a second skin. Her desire to reclaim Jimmy isn't about control. It's about legacy. About giving that child a chance to grow in the light, not in the darkness of a family like the Weboys. George understands this, even if he doesn't always say it aloud. And it's that understanding, that shared grief and love, that binds them tighter than ever. What begins to take shape isn't just a plan, it's a reckoning. They know now what they're up against. They've seen the Weboys, felt their control, and they know that nothing short of confrontation will bring Jimmy home. The pieces are in place. The fire is building. And the cold plains of North Dakota are about to bear witness to a storm more personal and more dangerous than anyone could have predicted. The tension that had been simmering like a storm on the horizon now begins to churn, dark and undeniable. Margaret and George, having stood on the Weboys' doorstep and looked evil in the eye, are no longer simply visitors searching for family. They're interlopers in hostile territory. The weight of what they've seen in that eerie farmhouse, the quiet fear in Lorna's eyes, and the way little Jimmy clung to his new family like he'd forgotten the warmth of another, these images hang heavy in the air between them. Neither Margaret nor George speaks of it much, but both know they can't walk away. Not now. That night, the couple retreats to the room they've taken in town, Margaret restless, George staring out at the cold sky as if searching for answers in the stars. They go over every word exchanged with Blanche Weboy, every polite threat, every smile too sharp to be sincere. Margaret's resolve only grows. George, the man who's always leaned on caution and law, begins to see that this battle won't be won in a courtroom. The Weboys are above the law out here. Or worse, they are the law in their own twisted way. With Peter Dragswolf's quiet assistance, George returns to the outskirts of the Weboy property under the cover of darkness. He doesn't go armed, not yet. He goes to see, to understand. And what he finds confirms their worst fears. The house is lit up, voices raised within, Lorna scolded, her posture bent like a trapped bird. Donnie is no better than the rest of them. In fact, in many ways, he's worse. Cowed by Blanche but cruel in his own right, Donnie's control over Lorna isn't love, it's ownership. And Jimmy? He's treated like a prize. Something to show off, not protect. The plan that begins to take form is simple in its desperation. Get Lorna and Jimmy out, quickly and quietly, before the Weboys catch on. Margaret reaches out to Lorna, subtly, cautiously, arranging a secret meeting away from the house. They find a moment near a corner store, where words are exchanged in whispers. Margaret begs her to leave. Lorna is terrified, not just of Donnie, but of Blanche. She's seen what happens when people cross the matriarch. She's heard stories, she's felt the backhand. But there's a flicker of hope in her voice when she says, "If you come for us, we'll be ready." Margaret and George prepare. Peter offers what he can, a place to rest, a ride, a quiet strength. The escape is set for the following night. A rendezvous under moonlight. A chance to vanish before the Weboys even realize what's missing. But plans, like peace, are fragile. That day, Margaret and George make a mistake. one born not of recklessness, but of humanity. They walk the town too long. Their presence draws attention. And before long, the Weboys know they're still around. Bill Weboy and one of his brothers show up at their hotel. What begins as a conversation quickly turns into a threat. But George, calm as ever, refuses to be intimidated. Until they make it physical. In a vicious, sudden attack, the Weboy brothers break into the room. George is caught off guard. Bill is laughing, but the violence is all too real. They beat George, then hold Margaret, forcing her to watch. It's brutal. It's personal. And when they leave, George's hand has been shattered. Margaret's trust in the rules, in decency, is gone. They weren't just sending a message. They were making a statement. Stay away, or we'll do worse. Bloodied and reeling, George refuses to give up. Margaret, shaken but burning with fury, steels herself. The escape must happen. No more waiting. No more talking. This has become something else, something deeper. It's about saving their grandson, yes. But it's also about standing up against something so twisted, so wrong, that to walk away would be to become complicit. Margaret retrieves the revolver George had once hidden. The old lawman knows how to use it. They head out once again into the North Dakota dark, determined to see this through. At Peter's urging, they change the location of the meeting with Lorna. It's no longer about sneaking away unseen. It's about confrontation. They arrive at the Weboy house as dawn begins to edge along the horizon. The light doesn't soften the place. It sharpens it, reveals its worn exterior and hollow soul. George, wounded but composed, walks through the front door with Margaret close behind. Lorna is inside, Jimmy beside her. The house is tense, the silence thick. And then Blanche appears. The final confrontation isn't a scene of screaming. It's a slow unraveling. Blanche tries, for a moment, to maintain control, to smile, to offer false warmth. But her voice is tinged with venom. When George insists on taking Jimmy and Lorna, the facade drops. The Weboy sons appear, weapons in hand, but George is faster. He fires first. The scene that follows is chaos. Not stylized. Not choreographed. It's messy, loud, terrifying. George is shot. A Weboy brother is killed. Margaret grabs Jimmy, shielding him with her body. In the midst of it all, Blanche screams, not in fear, but in fury. Her house, her empire, is crumbling. She pulls a gun, points it at Margaret. But Margaret, now holding George's revolver, doesn't flinch. She pulls the trigger. Blanche falls, the matriarch's reign finally ended. The aftermath is fire. George, mortally wounded, sets the house ablaze from within. It's his final act. A sacrifice not for revenge, but for peace. For Margaret. For Jimmy. He makes Margaret promise to take the boy and leave, to live, to remember. Not just him, but the love that brought them there in the first place. Margaret watches the flames consume everything. The house, the Weboy legacy, the pain. Her husband. She drives away with Jimmy in the back seat, Lorna beside her, the sky turning pale with morning. There's no music. No triumphant declarations. Just silence, the kind that follows storms. In that silence, Margaret finds what she came for. Not just her grandson, but a chance to move forward. To finally let go, not of love, but of grief. And for the first time in what feels like forever, the road ahead seems open again. The heart of Let Him Go beats not through its action, nor its violence, but through its characters, etched in silence, shaped by loss, and bound together by the invisible threads of family, duty, and love. These are not people who shout their truths into the wind. They carry them deep, like stone, beneath expressions lined with history. Every glance, every step, every decision is layered with past and present. And as the story unfolds against a backdrop of sweeping plains and gathering darkness, each character reveals themselves not all at once, but like a photograph developing in slow motion. At the center is Margaret Blackledge. She doesn't come into the story with fire in her hands. She builds it from embers. She is a woman formed by the contours of motherhood, and later by the shape of grief. Her love is quiet but fierce, expressed in gestures rather than declarations. When we first meet her, she is helping raise her grandson after the sudden death of her son James. There is no melodrama, no outburst of weeping. Just the steady perseverance of someone who has lost something irreplaceable and refuses to let the next thing slip away. Margaret's journey is not one of discovery, but of confirmation. Her love is quiet but fierce, expressed in gestures rather than declarations. When we first meet her, she is helping raise her grandson after the sudden death of her son James. There is no melodrama, no outburst of weeping. Just the steady perseverance of someone who has lost something irreplaceable and refuses to let the next thing slip away. Margaret's journey is not one of discovery, but of confirmation. From the moment she senses that Lorna and Jimmy are in danger, she already knows what she has to do. Her instincts are rarely wrong, but what makes her compelling isn't just her ability to sense danger, it's her refusal to ignore it. In a world that often tells women to sit down, to be quiet, to let the authorities handle it, Margaret chooses movement. She becomes the driving force behind the journey that gives the film its name and purpose. She doesn't ask George for permission. She invites him to stand with her, knowing that he will. That invitation brings us to George Blackledge, the former sheriff, the stoic observer, the man who speaks less and sees more. George is a relic in the best sense of the word, a man whose principles are shaped by decades of quiet justice, who carries the weight of law in his bones even though he's laid his badge down. When Margaret asks him to follow her across state lines to find their grandson, he doesn't question the morality of it. He simply assesses the danger. George is not a man of impulse. He's a man of readiness. But even in his caution, there's warmth. His relationship with Margaret is one of the most powerful elements of the story. It is a marriage not built on dramatic declarations, but on deep trust. He follows her into the unknown not because he's brave or fearless, but because she is. And because he understands that some things matter more than safety. George's transformation throughout the film is subtle, but profound. From the man who hesitates at first to intervene, to the man who ultimately sacrifices himself for his family. It's a journey of accepting that love sometimes demands action, even when the odds are stacked against you. Then there is Lorna, the soft-spoken daughter-in-law who finds herself trapped between two lives, the one she lost with James, and the one she's forced into with Donnie Weboy. Lorna is not a character who begins strong. She begins hidden, restrained, shaped by fear and silence. But there is strength in her, a quiet resilience that doesn't go unnoticed. Even in the most oppressive scenes within the Weboy house, she maintains a kind of dignity. She doesn't scream for help because she knows no one would hear her. Instead, she endures, waiting for the moment when escape might be possible. Her evolution comes not in bold leaps, but in moments of trust. When she meets Margaret secretly, when she agrees to flee, when she allows herself to believe in a better future for Jimmy, these are acts of courage. Not loud, but essential. Lorna represents all those who have been silenced by fear, who are waiting for a hand to reach out and say, "It's okay to run now." And when that hand comes in the form of Margaret's, she takes it, not because she's weak, but because she knows it's time. But what of the Weboys? They are not simply villains. They are a clan, twisted, bound by loyalty, and shaped by their own brand of survival. At their head sits Blanche Weboy, a matriarch as chilling as the wind that rolls off the Dakotas. Blanche doesn't scream or threaten. She doesn't need to. Her power lies in her control, in the way she speaks sweetly while her sons simmer with violence beside her. She's a woman who demands loyalty not out of love, but out of fear. And her grip over her family is suffocating. Lesley Manville's performance gives Blanche a terrifying elegance. She rules her home like a queen presiding over a crumbling kingdom, her politeness a thin veil over deep rot. Her scenes at the dinner table, where hospitality masks intimidation, are some of the most tense in the film. She represents the kind of evil that doesn't see itself as evil. She believes in her authority, in her right to control her sons, her daughter-in-law, her grandson. And that belief makes her dangerous. Donnie Weboy, her son and Lorna's abusive husband, is not complicated in the way Blanche is, but he is no less chilling. Donnie's cruelty is impulsive, unpredictable. He is a man who uses fear because he has nothing else to offer. His rage is not rooted in strength, but in weakness. He lashes out because he lacks control even over himself. But it is Blanche's influence that allows him to remain dangerous, her enabling, her approval. Together, they form a toxic dynamic that feeds on silence and submission. The other Weboy brothers, silent looming figures, don't need dialogue to instill fear. They are muscle and menace, shaped in Blanche's image, tools sharpened by a lifetime of her influence. Their presence reinforces the idea that evil isn't always personal. It can be systemic, passed down, reinforced, and left unchecked. And then, amidst all of this, there is Peter Dragswolf. Peter is a quiet soul, a young Native American man who offers George and Margaret a place of rest, a safe moment in a world closing in. His backstory, of being taken from his family and raised by white missionaries, is never the focus of the film, but it lingers. His pain is present, understated, but deeply resonant. Peter's character offers more than just shelter. He offers reflection. He, too, has known what it means to be taken, to be lost, to be remade in someone else's image. And in that, he sees Margaret and George not as outsiders, but as fellow travelers through sorrow. Peter doesn't join them in the final confrontation because he is not part of their fight. But his presence in the film is vital. He reminds us that the themes of loss, control, and recovery stretch far beyond this one family. That the land they walk on is filled with stories like his, unheard, unseen, but no less important. And at the center of all this stands Jimmy. He's not old enough to understand the war being waged over him, but his presence shapes every decision, every sacrifice. Jimmy represents hope, the chance to do better, to break a cycle, to raise a child in love rather than fear. And though he speaks little, his innocence is powerful. In the final moments, when he clings to Margaret and looks out at the road ahead, we understand. He is the future. And everything we've seen, the fire, the grief, the courage, was for him. Let Him Go doesn't draw its characters in bold strokes. It draws them in shadows and light, in pauses and glances, in moments where the quiet says more than words. It's a film where love is tested not by grand gestures, but by persistence. Where evil isn't flamboyant, it's patient, manipulative, and deeply embedded. And where heroism isn't about strength, but about standing up even when you're shaking. The characters of Let Him Go are unforgettable not because they shout, but because they endure. They survive. They choose love over and over again, even when it costs them everything. And in the stillness that follows the fire, their stories remain. They remind us that love is not always gentle, that sometimes it goes to war. And when it does, it wears the face of a grandmother, a father, a quiet soul on the edge of the world, refusing to let go. Behind every haunting frame of Let Him Go, every whispered exchange and stark moment of silence stretched across the cold prairie, there are stories just as fascinating as the ones unfolding on screen. On its surface, the film is a period drama wrapped in a slow-burn thriller, quiet and patient in its intensity. But the making of Let Him Go has its own collection of strange twists, unusual moments, and quiet surprises. Truths buried behind the camera like secrets waiting to be found. To begin with, the casting of Kevin Costner and Diane Lane wasn't just a clever pairing, it was a reunion with history. Many viewers immediately recognized the duo from Man of Steel, where they played Clark Kent's adoptive parents. But Let Him Go offers a very different kind of parental performance. Still, the comfort between them wasn't manufactured. Their on-screen chemistry stemmed from a shared understanding and a deep familiarity that had been building across years. According to director Thomas Bezucha, casting them wasn't a coincidence. It was a conscious decision to bring in two actors who could radiate depth and shared history without needing to speak it aloud. That quiet shorthand between them helped shape one of the most emotionally believable marriages seen in recent years on film. What's stranger is that Kevin Costner almost didn't take the role. Known for his preference for scripts that let him dig into iconic Americana or larger-than-life roles, Let Him Go was an unusual pivot, a slow-moving, emotionally complex story about aging and loss. But it was the script's silence that sold him. Costner later said in an interview that the story didn't try to be loud. It didn't try to be cool. It just was. He liked the restraint, the morality. The idea of a man whose heroism wasn't in his fists, but in his patience. Once he signed on, the tone of the film began to take its true shape. Filming took place across Alberta, Canada, not North Dakota or Montana, where the story is set. The wide, empty landscapes of Alberta provided the raw, open vistas needed to capture the lonely tension of the story. But shooting there wasn't without its surprises. At one point during filming, a sudden, unpredicted snowstorm swept through, forcing the crew to halt production for an entire day. Interestingly, the footage that was captured during the early stages of that storm, those first, delicate flakes, ended up being used in several transitional scenes. It wasn't in the original shooting schedule, but the director and cinematographer agreed that the weather had gifted them a layer of atmosphere they couldn't have planned better if they tried. Another unexpected challenge came from the film's quiet star, the 1960s-era cars. The production prided itself on accuracy. Every vehicle used in the film was a period piece, sourced from collectors and restoration garages across Canada. While they looked beautiful on screen, they weren't always cooperative. Diane Lane reportedly had difficulty starting the car used in the opening scenes multiple times, resulting in takes being delayed or reset. One vehicle refused to start at all one day, leading to a last-minute substitution that was digitally color-corrected in post-production to match previous shots. That's the magic of movie making. You never know when a classic car might decide it's done being a star. The Weboy farmhouse, one of the most important locations in the movie, was not a single structure. It was actually a clever composition of multiple locations stitched together to appear seamless. The exterior was filmed on a ranch outside Fort Macleod, while the interiors were built on a soundstage. Production designer Trevor Smith wanted the house to feel imposing without being overtly gothic. "We wanted it to breathe danger," he said in an interview, "but also feel like it had once been a home." Everything inside the house, from the wallpaper to the china in the cabinets, was chosen to reflect a frozen-in-time sense of control, Blanche Weboy's influence embedded in every surface. Speaking of Blanche, Lesley Manville's performance might be the film's most unnerving, and it came with its own strange preparation. To get into the character's psyche, Manville reportedly avoided rehearsing scenes too much with the other actors. She wanted Blanche's interactions to feel slightly off, as if her energy didn't match the room. It was a choice that worked eerily well. During the infamous dinner table scene, where Blanche serves pork chops while making veiled threats, the discomfort was so palpable that Kevin Costner later admitted he forgot a line, not because he didn't know it, but because "she had me rattled." Even stranger was the decision to use real pork for the scene. Often, food on movie sets is fake or barely cooked to preserve continuity. But the filmmakers decided that real food, cooked fresh for every take, would add to the authenticity. The problem? The smell. After hours of filming under hot lights with plates of pork being reset again and again, the cast reportedly started to feel nauseated. Diane Lane joked that by the time the scene wrapped, no one ever wanted to see pork chops again. Boo Boo Stewart, who portrayed Peter Dragswolf, had his own unique path into the film. His role was originally smaller, but during rehearsals and early readings, Stewart brought such grounded empathy to the character that the director expanded his part. Stewart, whose own background intersects with themes of displacement and identity, brought authenticity to a character that, while quiet, became crucial to the film's emotional rhythm. There's a rumor among the crew that one of Peter's lines, a reflection about losing his family, was unscripted and left in the final cut because of its impact on the scene. Music played an unusual behind-the-scenes role, too. While the film is light on traditional scoring, director Thomas Bezucha would play curated playlists on set to help actors tap into emotional moods before difficult scenes. Songs from Johnny Cash, Emmylou Harris, and Gillian Welch would drift through the set during lunch breaks or rehearsals, giving cast members a sense of the era and tone. Diane Lane was reportedly particularly moved by a Cash song that became her emotional anchor for the film's final scenes, though she never revealed which one. Another strange occurrence? The Weboy family name. It's original to the novel, but during location scouting, the crew discovered that Weboy was also the last name of a real family living not far from where they intended to shoot. They reached out to inform them, concerned they might object, but the family reportedly loved the idea, so much so that one member offered to be an extra. Whether he made it into the final cut remains uncertain, but the odd coincidence was a point of amusement for the crew. Costner, ever the perfectionist, brought his own touch of eccentricity to the shoot. He insisted on performing many of his own stunts, small ones, mostly, like pulling Margaret to safety or handling firearms, wanting the character to feel real in every movement. At one point, during a scene that involved a tricky maneuver inside a burning set, a crew member gently suggested a stunt double step in. Costner waved him off. "George wouldn't flinch," he said. "And neither will I." One of the most haunting and strangely moving facts about Let Him Go comes from the editing room. There's a deleted scene, never released publicly, that featured George and Margaret dancing in their living room in a dreamlike memory. No dialogue. Just the two of them swaying, a record playing in the background. The director cut it for pacing, but reportedly held onto the footage, saying it was too beautiful to be forgotten. It was filmed in one take, with no choreography, just Costner and Lane moving like two people who had loved each other through a lifetime. Finally, there's a quiet tribute buried in the credits. The film is dedicated, in part, to Bezucha's grandparents, people who lived through the kind of rural stillness and emotional restraint the film explores. He has said that Let Him Go was, in many ways, an ode to their resilience. "They didn't speak much," he once said. "But when they did, it mattered. That's the energy I wanted in this story." So next time you watch Let Him Go, remember, the silence you hear is layered with noise. The stillness is built from careful movement. And the characters you follow through snow and fire are carried by actors and artists who lived the story as deeply as they portrayed it. From the real weather to forgotten dance scenes, from car troubles to psychological distance, the film's production was as filled with emotion, surprises, and strange grace as the story itself. And that, perhaps, is what gives Let Him Go its haunting chill. Not just the wind on the plains, but everything left unsaid behind the scenes. There are films that shout and demand to be heard. Others, like Let Him Go, simply walk into the room, sit down quietly, and before you even realize it, your entire attention has turned. You lean in. You watch a little closer. And soon, you find yourself pulled into a current that runs deeper than you expected. While its pace is measured and its atmosphere subdued, Let Him Go earns its weight not with spectacle, but with moments, sharp, deliberate, and emotionally charged events that ripple far beyond the screen. To understand the film's impact, one must look closely at the pivotal moments that shape its emotional core and, ultimately, its critical reception. These events aren't just markers in the narrative. They are reflections of broader truths, symbolic decisions, and emotional flashpoints that give the story its lasting resonance. One of the earliest and most defining moments in the film is the sudden death of James Blackledge. It's a moment that takes place off-screen, but its absence becomes a powerful presence throughout the story. In terms of narrative structure, it's a quiet bombshell. There are no screams or dramatic revelations, just the shift in Margaret's expression, the stillness in George's eyes, and the silence that descends upon their ranch. Critics noted the bravery in that decision, to remove the expected melodrama and instead allow grief to settle in like snowfall. In many ways, that absence becomes the first real character in the film. It informs every decision Margaret and George make, every mile they travel, and every risk they eventually take. It also sets the tone for the kind of storytelling the film promises: emotionally driven, restrained, and deeply human. From a thematic standpoint, James's death also introduces the motif of loss, not just of life, but of control. Margaret loses her son, then her connection to her grandson. George loses the sense of a future he'd once envisioned. And Lorna, perhaps more quietly, loses the security and freedom that came with being James's wife. The ripple of one man's death spreads through multiple lives, and the film never lets you forget it. Critics like Justin Chong of the Los Angeles Times pointed out that this ripple effect is what elevates Let Him Go from a standard family drama to a meditation on the legacies of grief. The next significant event, the sudden disappearance of Lorna, Donnie, and little Jimmy, is less of a twist and more of a tightening rope. When Margaret discovers they've left town without a word, the dread doesn't come from surprise, it comes from confirmation. She already suspected something was wrong, and now she knows it. From a storytelling perspective, this moment is brilliantly handled. It's not framed as a shock, it's framed as a slow, sickening truth finally coming into focus. Margaret's decision to pursue them is not born of impulse, but necessity. And here, critics saw one of the film's strengths emerge in full: the character of Margaret Blackledge as a portrait of quiet determination. Diane Lane's performance drew consistent praise, particularly for the way she infused every decision with maternal gravity. She doesn't rage. She doesn't break down. She simply decides. Her character is the emotional compass of the film, and this early act of choosing to go after her grandson becomes the story's backbone. As George and Margaret travel deeper into the dark, they cross a threshold, not just geographically, but morally. The film's mood shifts subtly with each mile, and critics took notice of how effectively the cinematography and pacing supported this descent. What begins as a domestic drama slowly morphs into a thriller with the suspense of a noir. The long stretches of quiet road, the looming landscapes, and the sense of isolation all build tension without a single gun being drawn. It's in the long glances exchanged at roadside motels, the uncertain pauses during small-town conversations, the growing sense that the Weboys are not just a family, they're a trap. The dinner scene at the Weboy house is arguably the film's most famous sequence, and for good reason. From a critical viewpoint, this is where the movie turns. It's the moment when everything the audience has feared crystallizes. Blanche Weboy's entrance, delivered with eerie poise by Lesley Manville, shifts the tone entirely. The scene becomes a psychological standoff. The dinner scene at the Weboy house is arguably the film's most famous sequence, and for good reason. From a critical viewpoint, this is where the movie turns. It's the moment when everything the audience has feared crystallizes. Blanche Weboy's entrance, delivered with eerie poise by Lesley Manville, shifts the tone entirely. The scene becomes a psychological standoff, with each character trying to maintain composure while threats simmer beneath every word. Critics lauded this moment as the film's high point, one that weaponizes silence and social niceties to brilliant effect. From a thematic angle, the dinner isn't just a scene of tension, it's a clash of values. Margaret and George represent a kind of old-world integrity, built on duty, empathy, and justice. The Weboys, on the other hand, represent decay. Blanche, in her unsettling control of her sons, becomes a perverse mirror of Margaret. Both are matriarchs. Both fiercely protect their families. But Blanche uses control where Margaret uses love. This duality, critics observed, gave the film depth that elevated it above its genre. And then comes the violence. The beating George suffers at the hands of the Weboy brothers is not stylized. It's raw, quick, and horrific. There's no music swelling, no cinematic posturing, just the sound of fists, bone, breath. This scene marks a turning point, not just in the narrative, but in the psychology of the film. George, the man who held back, who believed in waiting, in watching. He now understands that waiting will get them killed. The injury to his hand is not just physical. It's symbolic. The hand of justice is broken. The old rules no longer apply. This sets up the film's final act, which critics approached with a mix of admiration and sorrow. The ending of Let Him Go does not offer easy closure. It offers sacrifice. George's decision to walk into the Weboy house, knowing full well he might not walk back out, is made with the kind of quiet courage that most modern films don't allow anymore. Critics such as Richard Roper and A.O. Scott highlighted this as a rare choice in contemporary cinema, to allow an aging male character to be heroic not through power, but through love. George's death, and the fire that follows, is cathartic but devastating. It's not triumphant. It's necessary. His sacrifice frees Jimmy. It frees Lorna. And it allows Margaret to live on, carrying both her grief and the legacy of her husband's love. From a narrative standpoint, it completes a cycle. From a critical standpoint, it's a masterstroke. The fire consumes the Weboys' grip on power, their decaying kingdom of control, but it also consumes part of Margaret's heart. But even here, in the ashes, the film doesn't rush to wrap things up. The final scenes are slow, deliberate. Margaret driving away with Jimmy. No words. Just the road. The landscape. The sky. Critics repeatedly praised this choice, to end not with resolution, but with continuation. The story is over, but life goes on. And in that quiet final image, the film makes its most profound statement. Healing doesn't happen in a moment. It happens mile by mile. The film's reception reflected its quiet power. It was not a box office juggernaut. It didn't dominate awards season. But it settled into the minds of critics and viewers alike like snow falling on a field. Soft, unnoticed at first, until you look again and realize everything is covered. Critics admired the film's refusal to pander. Its unwillingness to inject modern action tropes or cheap twists. Instead, Let Him Go earned its tension through character. It invited viewers to sit with their discomfort, to understand that evil can be subtle and that courage can be quiet. It asked them to believe that love doesn't always save the day, it often costs everything. In the months after its release, as more people discovered the film on streaming platforms, conversations began to shift. Viewers praised its emotional depth, its haunting tone. Many called it one of the most overlooked films of 2020. Some connected with Margaret's relentless maternal devotion. Others with George's steady dignity. Some even confessed to crying during the end credits, not because of what happened, but because of how deeply it made them feel. And that, perhaps, is the film's greatest achievement. It doesn't dazzle. It doesn't twist. It lingers. Like grief. Like love. Like a road that keeps going, long after the fire dies down. In the end, Let Him Go is a film built from stillness. From eyes that speak. From losses that never quite leave. Its events may be few, its pace unhurried, but its emotional weight? Immense. And every critical perspective, every careful frame, reminds us. Sometimes, the most powerful stories are the ones that speak softly, and still echo. In the world of Let Him Go, the wind whispers through tall grass, grief lingers in the silence between glances, and tension rises like a thunderstorm across the plains. But far beyond the screen, behind the stark beauty of its landscapes and the quiet intimacy of its characters, exists another story, one that unfolded day by day on set. A story of creative vision, unexpected hurdles, and moments of serendipity that helped shape a film so rooted in emotion that even the cast and crew found themselves changed by it. The production of Let Him Go was more than a technical process. It was a journey. Director Thomas Bezucha didn't set out to make a traditional thriller. What drew him to adapt Larry Watson's novel was its emotional honesty, its thematic richness, and the rare opportunity to tell a story driven by a couple in their later years, rarely the focal point of contemporary cinema. From the outset, Bezucha's vision was clear, a film that honored silence, respected stillness, and captured emotional truth without overstating it. That meant every decision, from casting to location to costume, had to be steeped in authenticity. The first step was casting the right leads. Kevin Costner and Diane Lane were at the top of Bezucha's list. There was no plan B. Their previous work together in Man of Steel as Superman's adoptive parents had already revealed a chemistry built on quiet strength and trust. But Let Him Go required something even deeper, the ability to convey decades of shared life through subtle movements, shared silences, and unspoken pain. Once the two were on board, the emotional foundation of the film was set. According to Lane, one of the first rehearsals between her and Costner took place without a script. They sat in silence, simply occupying space as George and Margaret. "We didn't need dialogue," Lane later said in an interview. "We just needed to find the rhythm of their silence." That silence would become one of the film's most powerful tools. Filming took place primarily in Alberta, Canada, with locations in Calgary, Drumheller, and Fort Macleod standing in for Montana and North Dakota. The decision to shoot in Alberta wasn't just for logistics, it was about finding landscapes that felt vast yet isolating, beautiful yet indifferent. The location scouting process was exhaustive, and the production team drove thousands of miles searching for the perfect combination of desolation and grace. One of the first challenges was weather. Filming began in early spring, with the hope of capturing the cold, wind-brushed atmosphere of a North Dakota fall. But nature had other plans. A surprise snowstorm early in the shoot disrupted scheduling but, in classic filmmaking fashion, turned into an unexpected gift. The flurries created a haunting texture to several outdoor scenes, especially those of Margaret and George on the road, and ended up making their way into the final cut. "The weather wrote half our script," Bezucha joked during post-production. The film's production design was meticulously crafted to reflect the 1960s setting without drawing too much attention to itself. Everything, from wallpaper patterns to the curve of a kitchen faucet, was sourced with care. Production designer Trevor Smith wanted the world to feel lived in and real, but not nostalgic. "We weren't going for a postcard version of the past," he explained. "We were going for the version that left scars." The Blackledge home, seen early in the film, was built partially on location and partially on a soundstage. It needed to convey warmth, loss, and resilience all at once. In contrast, the Weboy house, looming, isolated, and cold, was a patchwork of multiple locations. The exterior was shot on a lonely property outside Fort Macleod. Interiors were created on soundstages, lit deliberately to feel dim and overbearing, with furniture chosen to look rigid and outdated. Every object in the Weboy house was designed to reflect Blanche's control. Lesley Manville, who played Blanche Weboy, made several creative suggestions to deepen the character. She asked for subtle details, like a specific kind of lipstick or a ring she always wore, to hint at Blanche's obsession with appearances. Her performance, chilling and composed, was enhanced by these small choices. One crew member said Manville stayed in character between takes during the more intense scenes, particularly the dinner scene, which many consider the film's most unsettling moment. "She didn't yell. She didn't pace. She just sat there and looked at you. And that was scarier than any scream." That dinner scene, a pivotal moment in the film, took nearly 3 days to shoot. It required intricate blocking, multiple camera angles, and delicate emotional calibration. The tension was so thick during filming that a silence reportedly fell over the crew, even when the cameras weren't rolling. The actors rehearsed the scene over and over, not to get it right, but to get it honest. Lane later described it as one of the most emotionally charged scenes I've ever filmed. Kevin Costner, meanwhile, brought his usual hands-on approach to production. He worked closely with Bezucha on character development, often reworking lines to sound more like George. Costner's background in directing gave him a unique perspective, and the crew welcomed his quiet leadership. He even offered input on the way George moved, slow, methodical, carrying the weight of age and responsibility. "George doesn't rush," Costner said. He's not afraid of silence. That's a lesson a lot of people could learn. But not all the intensity happened on camera. One day, while shooting a quiet scene by a riverbank, the crew had to pause filming because a group of curious deer wandered into the frame. Rather than scare them off, Bezucha called for a break. The animals lingered for nearly an hour, grazing peacefully nearby. The moment became a kind of meditative pause for the cast and crew, a reminder of the natural beauty surrounding them and the stillness the film was trying to capture. Boo Boo Stewart, who played Peter Dragswolf, brought a quiet power to his role and bonded deeply with both Lane and Costner. Off-screen, the three would often talk between takes about their characters' histories and the unspoken emotional threads running through the story. Stewart contributed to the character's backstory, helping flesh out Peter's personal losses and his connection to the land. One of the film's most poignant scenes, Peter gifting Margaret a horse, was reportedly added late in production to emphasize that connection. The horses themselves were their own cast of characters. Each had to be trained not just for riding but for camera blocking and behavior. One horse, a beautiful bay used by Costner in several scenes, became so attached to him that it would walk toward him between takes, even when unprompted. The animal trainer on set later joked, "That horse thought Kevin was its dad." Costume designer Janie Bryant paid special attention to the wardrobe, using clothing to express each character's evolution. Margaret's clothes, for instance, become slightly more muted and structured as the story progresses, reflecting her emotional shift from grieving mother to determined protector. Blanche's wardrobe was designed to feel out of time, overdone, almost theatrical, hinting at a woman desperate to preserve her illusion of control. In post-production, editor Jeffrey Ford worked closely with Bezucha to maintain the film's slow, deliberate pacing. There was pressure to tighten some sequences, particularly early road scenes, but the creative team resisted. They believed in the value of letting moments breathe. Test audiences responded positively, noting how the pacing allowed them to connect emotionally without being overwhelmed. The film's score, composed by Michael Giacchino, was intentionally minimalistic. Giacchino wanted the music to echo the landscape, not dominate it. He recorded several pieces using unconventional instruments, including wind chimes and bowed saws, to create a soundscape that felt like it could be carried on the prairie wind. One theme, used sparingly during George and Margaret's most intimate scenes, was written as a lullaby for lost love. When Let Him Go finally premiered in November 2020, it did so in the shadow of the pandemic. Theatrical releases were limited, and the film's quiet nature made it easy to miss among flashier releases. But word of mouth grew. Audiences who found it spoke of its stillness, its depth, and its beauty. Critics praised the film's integrity, its refusal to manipulate emotion, and its belief in the power of simplicity. One of the film's most enduring anecdotes comes from its final scene. As Margaret drives away with Jimmy and Lorna, the camera lingers on the road ahead. That shot wasn't planned. It happened when the camera operator, feeling the emotion of the moment, let the camera roll just a little longer. The resulting image, endless highway, soft morning light, was so evocative that Bezucha kept it. "Sometimes," he said later, "the most powerful moments come when you stop trying to control them." Let Him Go is a film shaped by intention and accident, by craftsmanship and intuition. Its production was marked not by explosions or spectacle, but by quiet choices: where to place a table, how long to hold a stare, when to let silence say more than dialogue ever could. It was built by artists who believed in the story they were telling. And through unexpected weather, animal interruptions, and emotional honesty, they created a film that doesn't just entertain, it stays with you. Because when all is said and done, the production of Let Him Go wasn't about making a movie. It was about telling a truth. One slow step, one quiet moment, one long, aching drive at a time. Behind the frost-laced windows, the wind-swept highways, and the tension-charged silences that thread through Let Him Go lies a very different story. One humming with creative energy, camaraderie, and the quiet electricity that sparks when a cast and crew find themselves in sync with a story that matters. While the film itself offers a somber, slow-burning tale of grief and resolve, the atmosphere on set was often a surprising blend of warmth, humor, and resilience. It was a production shaped by both the challenges of its rural Canadian locations and the deep emotional undercurrent its actors carried through every scene. At first glance, Let Him Go may not seem like a film that would birth lively behind-the-scenes moments. The tone is heavy, and its central couple, George and Margaret Blackledge, move with the weary grace of people weighed down by loss. But when the cameras weren't rolling, the world of the film looked quite different. Kevin Costner and Diane Lane, the heart of the story, brought with them not only gravitas but a lightness that kept the mood from growing too solemn between takes. According to several crew members, one of the most unexpected dynamics on set was Costner's dry sense of humor. Known for his stoic screen presence, Costner was frequently the one breaking tension during long shoot days with quiet quips and offbeat observations. Diane Lane, warm and effortlessly sharp, was the perfect counterpart. Their rapport went beyond professionalism. It was something unspoken, familiar. Lane once joked, "We spent so much time being quiet on screen, we had to make up for it with chatter between takes." One story that circulated among the crew involved a particularly emotional scene shot near the end of the film. George and Margaret in a motel, preparing for the final confrontation. The air on set was heavy. Everyone was quiet, giving the actors space. But just before the camera rolled, Lane made a subtle joke about Costner's cowboy boots squeaking too loud in a scene about mortality. Costner grinned, leaned down, exaggerated a step, and the room cracked into a moment of laughter. Then, within seconds, they both dropped back into character, like slipping into old coats. It was that blend of humor and seriousness that defined their presence. Shooting on location in Alberta offered its own surprises. The weather, unpredictable and often harsh, became both an obstacle and an unexpected character in the production. Early in the shoot, the crew faced an unexpected cold snap, sharp winds and sudden snow that threatened to derail outdoor scenes. But rather than reschedule, director Thomas Bezucha embraced the change. "The cold helps," he said. "You feel it in your bones, and so do the characters." The snow became part of the narrative atmosphere, its quiet menace mirroring the emotional chill of the story. One day, during a particularly frigid morning shoot on a stretch of highway outside Drumheller, the wind was so severe that dialogue became nearly impossible to capture. The crew was bundled in layers, their breath visible in thick clouds. Costner and Lane stood side by side, silent in character, but once "cut" was called, they burst into laughter as their faces turned red from the cold. A crew member offered them warm packs to hold between takes, and Costner responded, "What we really need is a fireplace and a few dogs." Lane nodded, "And a bottle of bourbon, but I'll settle for coffee." Much of the crew stayed in the same small town during production, and it created a rare intimacy. Meals were shared in the same cafes, nightly dailies were watched in makeshift projection rooms, and it wasn't uncommon for actors, camera operators, and makeup artists to end the day together over soup and stories. The small-town setting mirrored the themes of the movie in unexpected ways: proximity, connection, and the unspoken trust that builds when everyone is far from home, working toward the same goal. The Weboy family scenes, especially those involving Lesley Manville's Blanche, were among the most intense to shoot. But the set dynamics often surprised everyone. Manville, whose portrayal of Blanche was cold, manipulative, and terrifying, was one of the warmest presences off-camera. She would chat with extras between takes, compliment crew members on their scarves or lunch choices, and offer to help reset a prop if she was nearby. One crew member shared that during the chilling dinner table sequence, where Blanche exerts icy control over Margaret and George, Manville broke the tension between takes by reciting lines from Absolutely Fabulous, sending the crew into fits of laughter before diving back into character with eerie precision. That dinner scene was a monumental task. It took 3 full days to film, involved complex lighting setups to capture the dim, shadow-filled interiors, and demanded subtle performances from each actor. The crew rehearsed endlessly, blocking each movement carefully, ensuring every word and glance landed with the right rhythm. The tension had to build gradually. Nothing overt, just a slow unraveling. The smell of cooked pork chops, used for authenticity, became so overwhelming after multiple takes that Diane Lane asked the prop team, half seriously, to consider using plastic food next time. They didn't, but they added more ventilation. Not all challenges were creative. Some were logistical. The production's choice to rely on period-accurate vehicles meant dealing with a handful of temperamental classic cars. On more than one occasion, a car refused to start, causing unexpected delays. Kevin Costner took it in stride. "These cars have more personality than Donnie," he once muttered, patting the hood of a stubborn Buick. It became an ongoing joke that the cars, like the Weboys, were unpredictable at best. Animals played an unexpectedly charming role in production. The horses used in several scenes had their own trainers and routines, but one horse, used in multiple key scenes with Costner, grew so attached to him that it would follow him between takes. "It's your emotional support horse," Lane teased one day. Costner played along, calling the animal partner, and whispering lines from the film to it when bored. The bond between actor and animal added a layer of authenticity to the scenes they shared. Boo Boo Stewart, who portrayed Peter Dragswolf, added quiet gravitas to the film with minimal dialogue. But off-screen, he became something of a favorite among the crew. Known for his humility and easygoing nature, Stewart often helped younger extras relax during shooting. In one scene, where Peter helps Margaret and George recover from an attack, the physical demands were intense. Stewart offered to run his scenes multiple times so the camera team could capture different angles, even though it wasn't required. The crew appreciated his commitment, calling him the glue in the quiet scenes. Director Thomas Bezucha fostered a collaborative atmosphere. He was known for encouraging suggestions from all corners of the crew, whether it was lighting advice from a grip or wardrobe feedback from a stand-in. On one occasion, a young production assistant mentioned that Margaret's coat should look like it's been hugged too many times. The comment struck a chord. The costume department added subtle wear to the coat's cuffs and collar, small changes that made it feel lived-in, real. Bezucha later cited that moment as an example of how deeply everyone cared about the story. And that care extended into post-production. Editor Jeffrey Ford, working closely with Bezucha, combed through hours of footage with the goal of preserving the film's heartbeat. Some scenes were left untouched because their natural rhythm was perfect. Others were trimmed gently, the way you might prune a rosebush, careful not to damage the bloom. The editing team often remarked that certain moments didn't feel like acting. "It was like watching real people live through something," one assistant editor said. By the end of production, the cast and crew had formed a quiet bond. There were no wrap parties with loud music or confetti. Instead, the final night was marked by a simple gathering: coffee, warm bread, shared smiles. Lane toasted the crew with a quiet speech about gratitude and stories that matter. Costner, less sentimental, raised his mug and said, "We made something that whispers. And those kinds of stories, they echo longer." And they did. When Let Him Go was released, its calm power caught audiences off guard. It didn't come with explosive marketing or flashy visuals. But those who watched it felt something. Something grounded. Something real. The emotion behind the scenes, the laughter on cold mornings, the teamwork during long takes, all folded into the fabric of the film. Behind the curtain of Let Him Go was a crew who braved icy winds and long days, who believed in silence as much as dialogue, who built a story not with noise, but with care. And through every challenge, be it a moody car, a stubborn snowstorm, or a haunting scene that took days to perfect, they never lost sight of what they were making. A film about love, about loss, and about the quiet heroism found in everyday people. And perhaps that's what made it special. Not just the story on screen, but the one lived together behind it. In Let Him Go, the land isn't just a backdrop, it's a character. A silent, brooding force that breathes across every frame, watching the story unfold like a ghost that knows how everything ends. From the golden fields of Montana to the shadowy corners of North Dakota, the film's settings speak volumes without ever uttering a word. The way the camera moves across landscapes, the way shadows fall across worn wallpaper, the way stillness lingers in empty roads and snow-blown yards, all of it becomes part of a visual language that shapes not only how we see the story, but how we feel it. The story begins in the open plains of Montana, where George and Margaret Blackledge live on a ranch soaked in routine and the quiet ache of time. These early scenes are bathed in soft natural light, with wide-open shots that stretch endlessly. The sky is vast, unbroken. The house, humble and solid, stands like a monument to a life built on patience. There's something deeply comforting about the early visual palette: warm browns, soft blues, faded greens. The world feels old, but not yet broken. Cinematographer Guy Godfrey captures these moments with long, still takes, letting the environment speak for itself. We feel the comfort of home, the gravity of routine, and the small joys that come from knowing a place too well. But even in those peaceful early moments, the camera hints at something else. The way it lingers a little too long on empty rooms. The way it watches Margaret in the kitchen from a distance, almost as if it knows what's coming. There's a sense of watching from afar, like the land itself is holding its breath. That subtle visual restraint becomes one of the film's greatest strengths. It never forces emotion. It trusts the audience to see what isn't said, to notice what isn't explained. As the story progresses and the Blackledges begin their journey to find their grandson, the settings shift, and with them, the mood. The road becomes its own kind of liminal space, an in-between world where memory and fear ride shotgun. The towns they pass through are not bustling centers of activity, but quiet, faded places where time feels stuck. Gas stations with peeling paint, diners with too few customers, motels with flickering neon signs. These are spaces that echo the internal desolation George and Margaret carry. Each location is carefully chosen, not for its flash or drama, but for its emptiness. It's quiet. One particularly striking aspect of the setting is the way it balances beauty and menace. The landscapes are gorgeous: snow-dusted fields, forests with golden leaves, rivers cutting through valleys, but they're never just pretty pictures. They always feel just a little too empty, a little too still. The vastness, instead of being comforting, begins to feel isolating. The characters are small against the land, and as the narrative grows darker, the world around them seems to stretch further, swallowing them into its silence. The shift becomes most noticeable as they approach North Dakota, where the color palette drains. The warm tones of Montana fade into steely grays, muted blues, and cold whites. The sun is lower. The sky feels heavier. It's a subtle transformation, but an effective one. The environment mirrors the emotional descent of the story. The cinematography starts to close in, too. Shots become tighter, the camera more static. There's less movement, more waiting, more watching. The environment stops being a place and starts being a mood. Perhaps the most important setting in the film, both narratively and emotionally, is the Weboy house. Set apart from town, perched on its own stretch of cold earth, the house is a study in dread. It's not overtly haunted or broken. It's clean, almost too clean. Everything inside is stiff, outdated, and overly polished. It's a space that screams of control, of appearances being kept up at all costs. The way Blanche Weboy moves through it, like a queen in a crumbling castle, only reinforces the idea that this place is more than a home. It's a cage. For Lorna. For Jimmy. Even for Donnie and the other sons, who orbit Blanche like trapped animals. The lighting in the Weboy house is particularly telling. It's dim but not dark. Shadowy corners. Lamps that don't fully illuminate. Every scene inside that house feels like it's holding something back. The cinematographer uses negative space to build tension. What's outside the frame becomes just as important as what's in it. We never see the entire house. Just fragments. Just enough to know it's not safe. One of the most tense sequences in the film, the dinner scene, is enhanced entirely by setting and cinematography. The room is too quiet. The air too still. The camera rarely cuts quickly. Instead, it holds. It makes you sit in the discomfort. The characters are framed in ways that trap them within the image. Margaret and George placed slightly off-center, the wallpaper looming behind them like a second skin. Blanche, perfectly framed in the middle, exudes control. The scene is a masterclass in visual unease. Nothing dramatic happens physically, but the dread is almost unbearable. Nothing dramatic happens physically, but the dread is almost unbearable. And that's the power of the setting doing its job. Sound design plays a crucial role, too, though it's often overshadowed by the visuals. But if you listen closely, you'll hear how the world of the film breathes. The creak of wood floors, the hum of a refrigerator, the rustle of wind outside a window. These small sounds make the world feel lived in, and when they vanish, like in the final scenes, they create a vacuum. The absence of noise becomes louder than any score. Speaking of music, composer Michael Giacchino delivers a minimalist score that doesn't compete with the setting. It complements it. Soft strings, slow piano, restrained crescendos. The music floats in and out, like memory. It's never manipulative. It doesn't tell you how to feel. It just appears when it's needed. Like the wind. The motel rooms, the sheriff's offices, the dark stretches of road, all of these settings are rendered with a painter's eye. The motel room where George and Margaret recover from the Weboy brothers' attack is not just a place to heal, it's a space of reflection. The pale walls, the simple bed, the single lamp, it's where they truly reckon with the cost of what they're doing. The lighting in that room is soft, but with harsh edges. A visual reminder that even in rest, they are not safe. The final confrontation takes place in a setting that feels almost otherworldly, the Weboy house at dawn. The rising sun casts long shadows. The fire that consumes the house is not just literal, it's emotional. It burns away the grip of control, the twisted legacy of the Weboys, and the last remnants of Margaret's old life. The fire is warm, but it's not comforting. It's purifying. And the shot of Margaret driving away with Jimmy, the road stretching endlessly ahead, is filmed with an openness that finally feels earned. The horizon is no longer a threat. It's a possibility. The visual storytelling in Let Him Go is built on restraint. The camera never intrudes. It watches. It waits. And in doing so, it allows the audience to become part of the landscape. You don't just watch the story, you walk through it. You feel the cold wind. You hear the creak of that old floor. You sit in that car, staring down an empty road, wondering what comes next. This attention to setting and cinematic elements didn't go unnoticed. Critics praised the film for its visual elegance, its ability to build tension without relying on tricks or tropes. Audiences, too, found themselves caught off guard, not by what the film showed, but by how it showed it. The land became a reflection of the characters. The settings told the story before the characters even spoke. And in that balance between space and silence, the film found its voice. In the end, Let Him Go is a film built on quiet power. And its settings, lonely houses, wide roads, dark corners, are not just where the story happens. They are why it happens the way it does. They hold the memory of love, the echo of loss, the weight of decisions. And long after the story ends, those landscapes remain, etched in the mind like footprints in snow. Still, waiting, honest, like the film itself. In Let Him Go, words are measured, silence is heavy, and every glance between characters seems to carry a weight that stretches far beyond the moment. It's a film that doesn't raise its voice to be heard. Instead, it lets its themes simmer beneath the surface, revealing themselves slowly, like breath on a cold window or memories slipping between the cracks of old wood floors. The emotional resonance of this story comes not just from its plot, but from what it chooses to say through what remains unsaid. It's in the spaces between dialogue, in the long, quiet roads, and in the way love is tested not through action, but through endurance. At the core of Let Him Go lies the theme of grief. It's not grief portrayed in explosive outbursts or dramatic monologues, but grief that settles in. The kind that shapes your days and redefines your sense of purpose. The death of James Blackledge at the very beginning of the film sets everything into motion. And yet, we never see him die. We don't hear a scream or witness a tragedy. We simply find Margaret watching through the kitchen window as the horse returns without a rider. That choice, a quiet, indirect representation of loss, tells us everything we need to know about how this film will explore mourning. Margaret's grief is quiet, but active. She doesn't crumble. She doesn't weep in every scene. She moves. Her decision to find her grandson and ensure his safety is, at its root, a mother's attempt to reclaim some piece of what she's lost. It's not vengeance. It's not control. It's love. Love that refuses to give up, even after death. Her grief doesn't freeze her, it fuels her. George, on the other hand, processes grief through stillness. He retreats inward, burying emotion beneath duty and silence. A former sheriff, his identity is rooted in rules, protection, and understanding the difference between justice and vengeance. Throughout the film, he becomes the emotional anchor for Margaret, balancing her urgency with his caution. But as their journey unfolds, we see his grief start to evolve, from acceptance to guilt to finally sacrifice. His final act is not just heroic, it's redemptive. This contrast between Margaret and George reveals another central theme: the different ways love can manifest. For Margaret, love is action. For George, it is presence. And together, they represent a bond that has endured through years of loss and hardship, a relationship built on unspoken trust. The film never needs to flash back to their younger years. Their love is evident in how they look at each other, how they listen, how they continue forward, even when the road is unclear. Another powerful theme explored in Let Him Go is the concept of control, and more importantly, what happens when people refuse to relinquish it. Blanche Weboy is the embodiment of this theme. Her need to dominate her sons, her home, and ultimately her grandson, speaks to a twisted understanding of love. To Blanche, love is possession. And that possession must be protected at all costs. Her house is her kingdom, her sons her soldiers, and she rules with a chilling composure. This stark contrast between Margaret and Blanche creates one of the film's most poignant symbolic dynamics. Both women are matriarchs. Both will do anything for their families. But where Margaret is driven by a selfless desire to protect and nurture, Blanche is driven by power. This dichotomy is reinforced through visual symbolism. Margaret is often framed with windows behind her, open, light-filled, reflective of hope and transparency. Blanche, meanwhile, is filmed in dim rooms, her face half-lit, her body surrounded by rigid, outdated decor. Her environment is stiff, controlling, suffocating, just like her love. The Weboy family as a whole serves as a symbol of inherited trauma and toxicity. The sons, particularly Donnie, act out the behaviors taught to them. They don't challenge Blanche's rule because they've never been given the tools to think for themselves. The generational cycle of abuse is never made overt, but it's there, in every wince from Lorna, in every nervous glance from Donnie, in the simmering violence just beneath the surface. The film uses this family to explore how unchecked control can corrode a household from the inside out. Freedom, both physical and emotional, is another thread that runs throughout the film. For Lorna, leaving with Donnie after James's death isn't just a relocation, it's a surrender. When Margaret and George find her in North Dakota, she is smaller somehow. Her spirit is diminished, her voice softer. She is a prisoner in a place that pretends to be a home. Her eventual decision to escape with her son is a reclamation of self. It's not a dramatic rebellion, it's a whisper that turns into a roar. And it echoes one of the film's quieter messages, that sometimes survival is the bravest act. Children in the film are more than characters, they are symbols of what the future might hold. Jimmy, the young grandson, is not given long scenes of dialogue or emotional outbursts. He's quiet, observant, absorbing the world around him. In many ways, he is the reason every character makes the choices they do. He represents legacy, hope, the possibility of breaking the cycle. George's decision to die so that Jimmy and Lorna can live freely is a gesture that reaches far beyond the moment. It's about giving the next generation a chance to grow without fear. One of the most poignant symbolic elements in the film is the road itself. The journey that Margaret and George undertake isn't just geographical, it's spiritual. Every motel they stop at, every gas station they visit, every stretch of empty highway they travel, it all adds layers to their emotional journey. The road becomes a mirror, reflecting their memories, their regrets, their fears. It's long, winding, and unpredictable, much like grief, much like love. The motif of fire also plays a powerful symbolic role, especially in the film's climax. When George sets the Weboy house ablaze, he's not just destroying a physical structure. He's purging the poison that has taken hold of his family. The fire is cleansing, violent, and final. It's also a symbol of transformation. What's left in the ashes isn't just destruction, it's freedom. And in that moment, George becomes more than a protector. He becomes a redeemer. Nature, too, becomes a silent symbol. The open plains, the cold wind, the brittle trees, they're not just part of the setting. They echo the internal lives of the characters. The vastness of the landscape underscores the loneliness each character feels. The changing weather mirrors their emotional states, sunlight when there is hope, shadow when danger looms. In one subtle scene, as Margaret watches Jimmy from a distance, a single leaf falls from a tree. That moment, quiet and brief, speaks volumes. Things are changing. Life is moving on. Even clothing is used as a symbolic tool. Margaret's coat, worn through most of the film, becomes a kind of armor. It's heavy, warm, and familiar. As the film progresses, the coat becomes dirtier, more worn, reflecting her emotional journey. Blanche, in contrast, wears pristine, old-fashioned outfits. Her appearance is calculated, controlled, and resistant to change. Her clothes are a costume, an attempt to hold on to a version of herself that never truly existed. Throughout the film, silence itself becomes symbolic. The characters rarely speak more than they need to. But what they don't say carries just as much weight as what they do. The pauses, the glances, the restrained emotions, these become a language of their own. Silence symbolizes everything the characters have endured and everything they still carry. It also highlights the generational divide between action and inaction, between confronting pain and burying it. The film's title, Let Him Go, is itself a layered piece of symbolism. On the surface, it refers to the child, Jimmy, and the fight to save him. But on a deeper level, it speaks to grief, to letting go of the dead, of the past, of the guilt and the fear that keep us frozen. It's a call to action, but also a call to peace. For Margaret, it's about letting go of her son, not forgetting him, but accepting his absence. For George, it's about letting go of the life he once protected. And for Lorna, it's about letting go of a marriage that never offered love, only fear. Even the smallest details carry symbolic weight. The horses in the film, for example, represent freedom and control. James dies on horseback. Margaret offers Jimmy a toy horse. Peter Dragswolf, whose presence symbolizes resilience and quiet strength, is introduced through his connection to horses. They become vessels for memory, for power, for identity. By the end of the film, all of these themes and symbols coalesce into a story that feels both specific and universal. It's about one family's fight, yes. But it's also about the ways we all wrestle with loss. The way love can become both shield and sword. The way silence can hold both peace and pain. And how, sometimes, the only way to hold on is to let go. In Let Him Go, the story never insists on being grand. It insists on being true. And in that truth, Through its layered themes and poignant symbolism, it leaves something behind long after the final frame, a quiet ache, a small ember glowing in the dark. A reminder that love, even in its quietest form, is the fiercest force of all. In Let Him Go, there's a rhythm to everything. How the camera moves, how the light falls, how silence holds its breath just long enough to make you shift in your seat. The film doesn't rely on spectacle or fast cuts. Instead, it chooses patience, precision, emotional depth that stretches across every shot. It's a rare kind of filmmaking, one that believes in stillness, in restraint, and in the power of atmosphere. And what happens behind the scenes to create that atmosphere is as deliberate and intricate as the story itself. Director Thomas Bezucha, known for his sensitivity to character and tone, crafted Let Him Go with a clear vision, to tell a story of grief, love, and quiet bravery without drowning it in melodrama. To do this, he brought together a team of artists: cinematographer Guy Godfrey, editor Jeffrey Ford, composer Michael Giacchino, and a dedicated production crew, who understood that sometimes the most powerful scenes are the ones that whisper instead of shout. Visually, the film is defined by its naturalism. The cinematography leans heavily into the landscapes of Alberta, Canada, which stand in for Montana and North Dakota. Wide shots are used generously, especially in the early parts of the film, to emphasize the openness of the land and the isolation of the characters. There's something haunting about how small George and Margaret look against the endless plains, especially as their journey grows darker. These compositions aren't accidental. They're carefully constructed to show the emotional scale of their mission, the weight of grief set against the silence of nature. Lighting is another crucial element. Rather than stylized or high-contrast lighting, Godfrey opted for soft, diffused sources that feel almost like natural daylight, even indoors. This choice adds a sense of realism and vulnerability. The Blackledge home, bathed in warm tones and sunlight, contrasts with the cooler, shadow-heavy interiors of the Weboy house, which is lit in such a way that it always feels half in shadow, even at midday. There's a sense that the light itself is afraid to enter. Camera movement throughout the film is subtle. There are very few handheld shots, no sweeping cranes or dramatic dollies. Instead, the camera often remains still, allowing the actors to move within the frame. When the camera does move, it does so slowly, tracking, gliding, breathing with the characters rather than directing them. This creates an intimacy between viewer and subject, a sense of being invited into their world rather than being shown it. One striking example is the way the camera follows Margaret through her home in the early scenes, just after James's death. It lingers just behind her, never rushing, letting the grief settle in organically. Editing, handled by Jeffrey Ford, plays a huge role in how the film's emotional beats land. Ford, whose work on films like Captain America: Civil War is known for pacing and clarity, shifts gears entirely here. In Let Him Go, editing is about breath. Ford lets scenes linger. He gives actors time to exist within their emotions before cutting away. Conversations unfold naturally, with pauses and hesitations intact. One particularly powerful sequence, the dinner scene at the Weboy house, is edited with a masterful sense of tension. There are long takes, close-ups that hold just a little too long, and reaction shots that speak volumes without words. The discomfort builds not through action, but through careful rhythm. Critics often point to that sequence as a turning point, both narratively and tonally, and the editing is a big reason why. Sound design in the film is perhaps one of its most understated triumphs. From the creak of floorboards to the wind whispering through trees, every sound is purposeful. There's no overuse of background noise. Instead, the film uses silence as a storytelling tool. In moments of high tension, it's not music that elevates the scene, it's the absence of sound. The viewer leans in, senses sharpened, waiting. This deliberate quietness mirrors the emotional reserve of the characters and deepens the sense of realism. Even in action-heavy moments, like the climactic confrontation in the Weboy house, the soundscape is grounded, raw, and intimate. The score, composed by the legendary Michael Giacchino, complements the visual and emotional tone without ever overpowering it. Known for his sweeping, emotive compositions in films like Up and Lost, Giacchino pulls back here, creating a soundscape that is sparse and haunting. His use of strings is delicate, almost hesitant, like a lullaby interrupted by grief. One recurring musical motif, a soft piano theme, returns in key moments, reminding the viewer that love and loss are inextricably linked. Giacchino's score doesn't direct your emotions, it echoes them. It's there when words fail. Color grading also plays a quiet but essential role in the film's emotional arc. Early scenes in Montana are warm, sepia-toned, filled with golden light that suggests memory, safety, and love. As the journey deepens and the Blackledges enter the Weboy world, the palette shifts. Colors become colder, blues, grays, pale yellows, reflecting not just the physical climate but the emotional chill of the Weboy household. The contrast between settings is subtle, but it tells its own story. When Margaret finally escapes with Jimmy at the end, the film allows some warmth to return, but it's subdued, cautious. As if hope is possible, but not yet certain. Costuming and production design work hand in hand with the cinematography to establish time and place without calling too much attention to themselves. Costume designer Janie Bryant, known for her work on Mad Men, was meticulous in her approach. Margaret's clothing, practical, muted, layered, tells us everything about her character. She's not here to make a statement. She's here to do what needs to be done. Blanche, on the other hand, dresses in clothes that feel preserved in time. Her outdated, carefully chosen outfits are a reflection of her need for control and appearance. These visual choices inform character in ways that words never could. Even the choice to keep dialogue sparse reflects a filmmaking philosophy centered on trust. Trust in the actors, the story, and the audience. There are no exposition-heavy speeches. No dramatic monologues. Just conversation that feels real. And when the characters can't find the words, the filmmakers let the silence do the talking. In one scene, George and Margaret lie in bed, reflecting without speaking. A shared look. A brush of the hand. It's one of the most intimate scenes in the film, and it's built entirely on the space the film allows for human connection. From a broader industry perspective, Let Him Go was a quiet triumph. Released in 2020 by Focus Features, the film debuted during a turbulent time in cinema. With theaters reeling from the effects of the pandemic, many films struggled to find footing. But Let Him Go, with its modest budget and intimate scale, managed to perform respectably. It opened at number 1 at the domestic box office during its first weekend, earning $4 million, a notable achievement for a character-driven drama in a year dominated by uncertainty. Its box office success was driven largely by word of mouth and the enduring appeal of its stars. Kevin Costner, already beloved for his roles in Dances with Wolves and Yellowstone, brought an audience with him, one that appreciated the film's quiet dignity. Diane Lane, long respected for her emotionally rich performances, was similarly praised. Together, they drew in viewers looking for something deeper than explosions and spectacle. Internationally, the film found a modest but loyal audience. Its universal themes, grief, family, resilience, translated across borders, and the film's visual language required no translation. Streaming platforms gave Let Him Go a second life, introducing it to audiences who missed it in theaters but were drawn to its slow-burn tension and emotional depth once word began to spread. Critically, the film was received warmly, with particular praise for its atmosphere, performances, and visual storytelling. Some critics noted its restraint as both a strength and a risk. In an age of fast cuts and constant stimulation, Let Him Go dared to slow down, to breathe, to make you feel rather than simply react. And that risk paid off. It became a film remembered not for its volume, but for its resonance. Behind the camera, Bezucha's direction was seen as a masterclass in tonal control. His ability to guide a film where nearly every moment is quiet, but never dull, is rare. He made a film that feels lived in, emotionally honest, and deeply American without falling into cliché. Every filmmaking choice, every lighting decision, sound edit, camera movement, serves the story, never distracts from it. The greatest filmmaking technique employed in Let Him Go might be its courage. The courage to be slow. The courage to be quiet. The courage to let its characters speak softly and trust that the audience will still hear them. In a cinematic landscape often filled with noise, this film finds its power in the spaces between.